Why Egyptian pharaohs married their own sisters. The genetic horror it created. When Howard Carter's team opened Tutankhamen's tomb in 1922, they found something almost as strange as the golden mask itself. More than 130 walking canes stacked and stored among his burial goods, many of them clearly used and worn down from real handling rather than left as ceremonial props. For decades, nobody could fully explain why a pharaoh who died before his 20th birthday needed so many. Egyptologists guessed at chronic illness, a limp, perhaps nothing more than royal excess dressed up as necessity. The boy king's body, when eventually X-rayed and later CT scanned, showed a partially clubbed left foot, degeneration in several bones, and a leg fracture that never had time to heal before he died. Carter's own diary entries from the excavation focus almost entirely on the tomb's gold and its cursed-sounding series of early deaths among the dig's patrons. Never once speculating that the boy king himself might have been physically frail, none of that, on its own, explained why his skeleton looked the way it did. That answer came in 2010 when a team led by Egyptologist Zahi Hawass ran DNA extracted from his mummy, and the mummies of several relatives through genetic testing for the first time. What they found did more than identify his parents. It confirmed a practice built into the highest levels of Egyptian kingship for well over 1,000 years. One ancient scribes wrote about openly, and modern geneticists can now measure precisely. Pharaohs married their own sisters, generation after generation, and the boy king's frail, cane-dependent body carried the biological cost of that tradition written directly into his bones. The divine justification. The practice did not start as medical ignorance or royal whim. It started as theology. At the center of Egyptian religious belief stood Osiris and Isis, a brother and sister born to the earth god Geb and the sky goddess Nut, who married each other and ruled together as the first king and queen of Egypt. When Osiris was murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother Set, Isis gathered his scattered body, restored him, and conceived their son Horus, the falcon god whose living form every reigning pharaoh was believed to embody. That myth was not treated as distant allegory. It functioned as the direct theological model for kingship itself. If a pharaoh ruled as the living Horus, and Horus was born from a marriage between siblings, then a pharaoh's own marriage to his sister was not a violation of divine order. It was a reenactment of it. Religious symbolism was not the only force at work for much of the 20th century. Egyptologists argued for what became known as the heiress theory, the idea that the Egyptian throne technically passed through the female line, meaning a man could only rule as pharaoh by marrying the woman who carried that inherited right, typically his own sister or half-sister. More recent scholarship has pushed back hard on that idea, pointing out that plenty of pharaohs took the throne without ever marrying a sister at all, and that the theory may have been a modern attempt to rationalize a practice that unsettled the historians studying it. What survives that revision is a narrower, more defensible point. A great royal wife carried real dynastic weight of her own, at times more directly tied to the throne than her husband. And marrying a sister, rather than an unrelated noblewoman, kept that inherited legitimacy entirely inside the family instead of importing a rival bloodline into the palace. It also solved a narrower, practical problem. A pharaoh's daughters and sisters occupied a social position so far above the rest of Egyptian nobility that almost no one outside the immediate royal family was considered an acceptable match. Marrying down risked diluting the throne's prestige in the eyes of the court. Marrying a sister avoided the problem entirely, at a cost historians and eventually geneticists would spend 3,000 years working out. Almost no other major ancient civilization normalized the practice at the royal level the way Egypt did. Mesopotamian, Hittite, and early Greek ruling houses all treated sibling marriage as a serious taboo, even among royalty, which makes Egypt's version of the custom less a universal feature of ancient kingship and more a specific theological choice tied to one particular myth about one particular pair of gods. A dynasty built on it. By the time the 18th dynasty began, around 1550 BCE, sibling marriage inside the royal family was no longer an occasional gesture toward myth. It was close to standard practice. Ahmose I, the dynasty's founder, and the pharaoh credited with expelling the Hyksos rulers from northern Egypt, married his full sister Ahmose Nefertari, who went on to hold significant religious authority of her own as God's wife of Amun, a title carrying both spiritual power and considerable landholdings. Their son and successor, Amenhotep I, continued the pattern, marrying his own sister Ahmose Meritamun. So did the pharaohs who followed him. Ahmose Nefertari's religious standing outlived her by centuries. Long after her death, she was worshipped as a patron deity of the Theban necropolis, one of the few Egyptian queens ever formally deified in this way, a status her marriage to her own brother apparently did nothing to diminish in the eyes of the priesthood that maintained her cult for generations. Thutmose II, son of Thutmose I by a secondary wife, married his own half-sister Hatshepsut shortly after their father's death, around 1493 BCE, a union that made her great royal wife and eventually positioned her to rule Egypt in her own right as pharaoh, one of the only women in Egyptian history to hold full royal titulary. Thutmose II and Hatshepsut had a daughter, Neferure, but no surviving son together. The male heir who eventually became Thutmose III was born instead to a secondary, non-royal consort named Isis, a detail that shows even at the height of the practice, sibling marriage guaranteed status and legitimacy rather than fertility or surviving sons. The pattern held for roughly 2.5 centuries, though not without exceptions. Amenhotep II and his son Thutmose IV both took secondary and foreign wives alongside their principal marriages. And not every great royal wife of the dynasty was confirmed as a full sister. Still, nearly every pharaoh of the 18th dynasty married a sister or half-sister at some point in his reign, even when, as with Thutmose III, the actual heir was eventually born to someone else entirely. By the reign of Amenhotep III, several generations removed from Ahmose I, the royal family's bloodline had folded back into itself often enough that nearly every recorded ancestor traced back to the same small founding pool of siblings and half-siblings, the Amarna family. Amenhotep III's own marriages reveal how selectively the tradition was actually applied, which matters for what came next. His great royal wife, Ti, was not his sister at all. Surviving inscriptions name her parents directly, a provincial couple called Yuya and Chuyu, making Ti one of the rare non-royal women to rise to the very top of the Egyptian court, apparently through personal influence rather than bloodline. Amenhotep III and Ti had several children, including a son who would take the throne as Amenhotep IV, and, partway through his reign, rename himself Akhenaten after abolishing Egypt's traditional pantheon in favor of exclusive worship of the sun disk Aten, relocating the capital to a newly built city at Amarna, and recasting himself and his family as the sole intermediaries between Aten and the Egyptian people. That theological shift, stripping away the old gods' priesthoods and their independent religious authority, concentrated legitimacy in the royal family more completely than at almost any other point in Egyptian history. And concentrated legitimacy is precisely the condition under which sibling marriage's old logic, keeping the sacred bloodline undiluted, would have felt most urgent to the people practicing it. Akhenaten's own marriages followed the older pattern his mother had technically broken, and then went further still. His most famous wife, Nefertiti, was almost certainly not his sister. No surviving inscription ever gives her the title of royal daughter, an omission Egyptologists consider too consistent across hundreds of surviving texts to be accidental. And later evidence may identify her father as I, a court official who would himself briefly become pharaoh after Tutankhamun's death. But Akhenaten held at least one other wife whose identity went unrecorded by name in any surviving text, known to modern archaeology only as the mummy labeled the Younger Lady, recovered from tomb KV35 in the Valley of the Kings. The 2010 DNA study identified her as a full sister of Akhenaten, daughter of Amenhotep III and T, and, more consequentially, as the biological mother of Tutankhamun. The most photographed queen in Egyptian history was not, as far as the genetic record shows, the source of the family's incest. That distinction belongs to a wife nobody bothered to name. Akhenaten's daughters raise a further unresolved question. Merit-Aten, his eldest daughter with Nefertiti, later became great royal wife to Akhenaten's own successor, Smenkhkare, whose exact relationship to the family remains debated. But inscriptions from the site of Ashmunain also record a princess called Merit-Aten Tasherit, Merit-Aten the Younger, in a scene some scholars date to Akhenaten's own reign rather than a later one, which would make Akhenaten himself her father, meaning Akhenaten may have fathered a child with his own daughter. Other Egyptologists reject that reading entirely, arguing the inscription was altered from an earlier scene originally depicting a different wife's child, and that Merit-Aten Tasherit may not have existed as a real individual at all. The evidence, unusually even by the standards of Amarna period scholarship, refuses to settle the question either way. What the bones actually show. The 2010 study did not stop at establishing who Tutankhamun's parents were. Researchers examined 11 royal mummies from the period in detail, comparing them against a control group of 5 unrelated royal mummies from an earlier dynasty, specifically to test whether the family's repeated close kin unions had left a measurable physical signature. They found one. Tutankhamun himself showed a partially clubbed left foot, degeneration consistent with Kohler disease, a disorder affecting the growth of the navicular bone, and a cleft palate, a congenital defect no artistic stylization can explain away. His skeleton also showed evidence of scoliosis and necrosis in several bones of the foot, conditions the study's authors described as part of an accumulation of malformations across the family, rather than isolated bad luck in one individual. Genetic testing additionally found traces of Plasmodium falciparum, the parasite responsible for the most severe form of malaria, in his tissue, suggesting he contracted the infection shortly before death, and that it worsened complications from the untreated leg fracture already visible on his mummy. Some later researchers have pushed back on parts of this picture, arguing the clubfoot diagnosis in particular may be overstated, and that Tutankhamun's canes could reflect ordinary royal ceremony rather than a genuine mobility impairment. The bone evidence for Kohler disease and the cleft palate has faced far less challenge. Getting to these conclusions was not straightforward. Ancient DNA degrades quickly in hot climates, and Egyptian mummies had spent 3,000 years in conditions generally hostile to preserving genetic material, which is part of why earlier attempts at royal mummy DNA testing had produced inconsistent or contested results before 2010. The Hawass team's study used more rigorous contamination controls and ran each sample through multiple independent extractions specifically to guard against that history of unreliable results, a methodological detail later researchers have generally credited as the reason its core findings on parentage have held up better than most prior ancient Egyptian genetic work. None of this proves inbreeding alone killed him, and the researchers were careful to say so. A single genetic disorder can arise without any family history of close kin marriage, and malaria killed ordinary Egyptians by the thousands, regardless of who their parents were. What the study could say with more confidence is narrower, and in its own way more damning. The specific clustering of disorders across multiple members of the same tightly interbred family, generation after generation, is exactly the pattern population geneticists expect when a small gene pool keeps recombining with itself, concentrating whatever recessive, harmful mutations happen to already be present, instead of diluting them with outside blood. The same study also settled a separate, decades-old debate. Amarna period art famously depicts Akhenaten and his family with elongated skulls, wide hips, and a strikingly androgynous build. A style some earlier researchers had proposed reflected a real underlying condition like Marfan syndrome. The 2010 examination found no skeletal evidence for Marfan syndrome or gynecomastia in any of the mummies tested. That unusual art, it turned out, was a religious and artistic choice tied to Akhenaten's theological reforms, not a window into the family's actual disfigured bodies. A distinction the study's authors took pains to state plainly, given how often the two had been conflated in earlier popular writing on the Amarna period. The real cost of the inbreeding was written in the bones instead, in details no chisel could soften or explain away. Beyond siblings, daughters too. Akhenaten's family was extreme, but it was not the last word on how far the practice could go. A century and a half later, Ramesses II, who reigned for 66 years and outlived most of his own children, married at least 4 of his own daughters: Bintanat, Meritamen, Nebetawi, and Hentmeyer. Bintanat, the first, bore him at least one further child, meaning Ramesses II fathered a grandchild who was, simultaneously, his own child. Egyptologists remain divided over how literally to read these unions. Some argue the title of Great Royal Wife granted to a daughter functioned mainly as an honorific, elevating her formal role in temple ritual without necessarily involving a consummated marriage in the ordinary sense. Others point to evidence that at least some of these daughters bore children credited to Ramses II himself, which is difficult to explain as pure ceremony. Either reading confirms the same underlying fact. By the 19th dynasty, the pool of people considered an acceptable match for a reigning pharaoh had narrowed so far that his own children were inside it. Ramesses II's most celebrated wife, Nefertari, for whom he built an elaborate tomb in the Valley of the Queens, was not his relative at all. A reminder that even at the height of the practice, marrying a sister or daughter was a political option available to a pharaoh rather than a strict requirement of every union he made. His 66-year reign, remarkable for its length, created its own separate problem. By the time he died, 12 of his sons had predeceased him, and the throne eventually passed to his 13th son, Merneptah, who was already in late middle age at his own coronation. The practical logic behind father-daughter unions mirrored the logic behind sibling marriage almost exactly. And by Ramses II's reign, the two practices had effectively merged into a single, escalating containment strategy. A princess who married outside the royal family carried her potential claim to the throne with her. A princess who married her own father or was formally installed as his great royal wife, regardless of the marriage's literal nature, kept that claim locked inside the palace. It was the same logic that had justified Osiris and Isis for over 1,000 years, and the same ambiguity that clouds Meritat and Tusherit's parentage, applied one more, uncomfortable degree closer to home. The Ptolemies take it further. Egyptian native dynasties eventually gave way to foreign rule, first Persian, then, in 332 BCE, Macedonian, when Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy took control of Egypt after Alexander's death and founded his own ruling line. The Ptolemies were ethnically Greek, and classical Greek culture treated sibling marriage as a serious taboo, closer to the modern reaction than anything in pharaonic tradition. That made what happened next unusual even by Egyptian standards. Starting with Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who married his full sister, Arsinoe II, around 275 BCE. The Ptolemaic dynasty adopted and then intensified the very practice their own culture back in Greece considered scandalous, explicitly invoking the Osiris and Isis myth and styling Arsinoe as a living Isis to justify the marriage to an Egyptian population already primed to accept it. Arsinoe II was no passive figurehead in that arrangement. She held significant political influence in her own right, appeared alongside her brother husband on coinage in a way earlier Ptolemaic queens had not, and had temples dedicated to her joint cult with Ptolemy II across Egypt. Of the 15 marriages Ptolemaic rulers made across the dynasty's nearly 300-year history, 10 or 11 were between full siblings, a rate exceeding even the 18th dynasty at its most concentrated, and the dynasty's habit of reusing the same handful of names, Ptolemy, Cleopatra, Berenice, Arsinoe, across generation after generation of sibling pairs, makes the family tree read, at a glance, almost like a single repeating loop. The pattern also proved politically volatile in ways separate from any question of genetics. Ptolemy IV had his own brother killed to secure the throne before later marrying his sister, Arsinoe III. Ptolemy VIII married one sister, Cleopatra II, then also married her daughter, his own niece, Cleopatra III, while still married to the first. And succession disputes between sibling spouses turned openly violent often enough that Ptolemaic family history reads, in long stretches, as a chronicle of betrayal running in close parallel to its chronicle of intermarriage. Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic ruler and the dynasty's most famous name, was the product of that pattern carried back several generations, a lineage of brother-sister, uncle-niece, and cousin-cousin unions, compounding on each other well before her own birth. She herself continued it in the most literal, dynastically formal sense, becoming co-ruler through marriage first to her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, and, after his death in the civil war that also drew in Julius Caesar, to her other younger brother Ptolemy XIV. By the time she took the throne, the Ptolemaic bloodline had been folded back into itself so many times, brother into sister, uncle into niece, across nearly a dozen generations, that genealogists mapping her family tree today describe it less as a tree than as a closed loop, a shape with almost nowhere left for a new ancestor to enter. Not just the palace. The assumption running underneath all of this, that sibling marriage was an exclusively royal phenomenon reserved for pharaohs claiming divine bloodlines, turns out to be only partly true, and the evidence complicating it comes from a much later and much more mundane source: Roman tax records. After Rome absorbed Egypt as a province following Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, imperial administrators conducted regular censuses for tax purposes, and the resulting papyri, preserved by Egypt's dry climate in extraordinary volume, recorded ordinary households in granular detail. Occupation, property, and family relationships included. Demographic historians Roger Bagnall and Bruce Fryer, working through these documents systematically, found that brother-sister marriage was not confined to the vanished royal court at all. Across surviving census returns from the 1st through 3rd centuries CE, roughly 15 to 20% of documented marriages were between full siblings, a rate that climbed as high as 37% in the city of Arsinoe and stayed above the general average across many surrounding villages. The finding cuts against a long-standing assumption in evolutionary psychology, sometimes called the Westermark effect, which holds that people raised together from early childhood, siblings included, typically develop a strong natural aversion to sexual attraction between each other, regardless of culture. Roman Egypt's commoner sibling marriages, if the census figures are read at face value, would represent one of the most sustained documented exceptions to that expected pattern anywhere in the historical record. which is part of why the phenomenon has drawn sustained attention from demographers and anthropologists well outside the field of Egyptology. These were not princes and princesses. The households recorded in these censuses belonged to farmers, artisans, and modest landowners. Ordinary Greco-Egyptian families with no plausible connection to Osiris, Isis, or any claim of divine bloodline whatsoever. The likeliest explanation historians have offered has nothing to do with theology and everything to do with property. Egyptian inheritance customs divided land and household wealth among children regardless of gender. And a sibling marriage kept an already fragmented family estate from being split further by marrying it out to strangers. Not every scholar accepts the numbers at face value. The historian Brent Shaw has argued the surviving census returns disproportionately capture Greek settler families concentrated in a handful of towns rather than the Egyptian population as a whole. And other researchers have raised a narrower but equally unsettled question: whether every recorded brother and sister in these documents were biological siblings, or whether the terms sometimes covered adopted relationships or half-sibling unions loosely described the same way. Whether this commoner practice descended from the older royal tradition, emerged independently from the same practical pressure that had originally shaped royal marriage strategy, or reflects some blending of Greek and Egyptian custom unique to the Roman period, remains genuinely unsettled among historians. What the census data does settle is simpler, and in its own way just as uncomfortable as anything found in Tutankhamun's bones. For at least 3 centuries, brother-sister marriage in Egypt was never only a palace secret. Legacy modern genetics has only been able to test a small fraction of the mummies this practice touched. The 2010 study of Tutankhamun's family remains one of the most detailed genetic analyses ever performed on ancient Egyptian royalty. And researchers have continued refining its methods since, applying improved DNA extraction and sequencing techniques to other royal mummies in the years that followed, sometimes revising earlier conclusions, including parts of the clubfoot and mobility diagnosis, as the technology and the debate around it both improve. The Ptolemaic dynasty, despite ruling for nearly 3 centuries and leaving behind one of history's most concentrated sibling marriage lineages, has never received comparable scientific attention, largely because so few Ptolemaic royal mummies survive in a condition suitable for DNA testing. Based on genealogy alone, that lineage should show the same accumulation of disorders documented in Tutankhamun's family, or worse. Whether it did will likely never be known with any precision, since the written record that survives from the Ptolemaic court, mostly Greek and Roman political history rather than medical description, was never interested enough in a Ptolemaic child's health to record it either way. That gap means the fullest genetic answer to a nearly 3,000-year-old royal tradition still rests almost entirely on one 18th dynasty family and one unusually well-preserved tomb. A single, narrow window standing in for well over 100 generations of Egyptian kings. Museums displaying Tutankhamun's mask and the Amarna family's statuary rarely mention any of this directly, a choice curators have defended as avoiding speculation. And critics have called a quiet omission of the very science that identified these people in the first place. Egypt's modern population, unrelated by any direct bloodline to the pharaohs who once ruled it, still lives among the physical evidence of that tradition. In temple reliefs of Osiris and Isis, in the golden mask of a boy king who needed over 100 canes to walk, and in the tomb inscriptions of women like Amos Nefertari and the nameless younger lady, whose marriages were never a scandal in their own time, only a theological necessity. What began as a myth about a murdered god restored by his sister's devotion ended 3,000 years later as a measurable pattern in a teenager's skeleton. One modern medicine can finally read, even if it cannot fully explain why an empire that understood surgery, astronomy, and engineering well enough to raise the pyramids never seemed to weigh the biological cost of keeping its bloodline. Quite literally, all in the family.